What you just heard was a brief moment from the streets of Phoenix, Arizona in the year 2004. It was not just noise. It was the sound of a crime unfolding in real time. The creak of bicycle wheels rolling to a sudden stop, the echo of gunfire ripping through the desert air, and the chaos that followed in the shadows of a suburban movie theater parking lot. In that instant, lives were altered forever. A robbery so quick, so brutal, and so unexpected that it left a community stunned and investigators scrambling for answers. On a quiet November night, armored car guard Robert Keith Palomares was ambushed outside the theater as he went about his routine. He was carrying the night's deposit, a heavy canvas bag stuffed with about $56,000 in cash, money that was supposed to make its way safely to the bank. Instead, Palomares never had the chance. In the space of just a few heartbeats, he was shot 5 times at close range. The force of the attack left him no time to react, no chance to defend himself. The killer snatched the money, mounted a bicycle, and vanished into the darkness of Phoenix's sprawling streets. The man behind the trigger was Jason Derek Brown, a figure as puzzling as he was dangerous. Brown wasn't a hardened bank robber with a long criminal record. He wasn't a mobster or a gang member. He was, on the surface, something else entirely. A self-styled entrepreneur. A man who wore designer clothes, flash smiles, and loved to show off expensive cars and luxury trips. A man who loved to be seen, who lived in appearances, but who could not pay for the lifestyle he wanted so badly. To friends, acquaintances, and strangers alike, he seemed likable, charismatic, even magnetic. Few people saw the other side of him. The debts piling up, the scams keeping him afloat, and the growing desperation that eventually pushed him into a crime of staggering violence. In the days that followed the murder, investigators began to uncover how calculated Brown's crime truly was. This wasn't a moment of blind rage. This was preparation. He had studied the routine of armored car guards, learned their schedules, and chosen his spot. He had prepared his weapon, a Glock pistol he would later abandon, and picked his getaway vehicle with the same cold pragmatism. A mountain bike, easy to maneuver and easy to disappear with, which he dumped just blocks away from the scene. Every choice pointed to a man who had thought this through. And yet, despite the careful planning, what came afterward was even more astonishing than the murder itself. Jason Derek Brown didn't just kill and rob. He vanished, as though he had melted into the air itself. For nearly 2 decades, his name carried a strange weight on wanted posters and FBI websites. His face, boyish and sun-bleached, became familiar to millions. He was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, an infamous haul of criminals who had to be found at all costs. His story appeared in newspapers, on television, even in magazines where readers learned about the playboy-turned-killer who had fled on a bicycle after gunning down an armored guard. He was spotted, or thought to be spotted, in state after state, sometimes even in other countries. Leads poured in. None of them ended in an arrest. Brown seemed always one step ahead, as though he had learned to live like a shadow. Years later, without fanfare, the FBI quietly removed him from their top 10 list, making room for other fugitives. But the case never closed. Jason Derek Brown remains wanted to this day, and Robert Keith Palomares' family still lives with the void left on that November night. A father, a husband, and a dedicated guard, Palomares lost his life while simply doing his job, and his killer, despite the headlines, the lists, and the searches, has never faced justice. This is the story of Jason Derek Brown, the charming fraudster turned cold-blooded murderer, a man who lived on the edge of fantasy and then crossed into infamy. And it is the story of how, even in a modern world filled with cameras, technology, and global communication, one man could seemingly disappear into thin air. Jason Derek Brown was born on July 1st, 1969, in Los Angeles, California. At first glance, his life looked like the story of a normal American boy growing up in the 1970s. He had siblings, a family, and a childhood that, at least outwardly, seemed stable. But as with many stories that end in tragedy, the details of his upbringing begin to paint a more complicated picture. His father was a man who left a heavy imprint on Jason's life, sometimes in ways that were not nurturing, but instead disruptive. By the time Jason was a teenager, his family life had fractured, and those early cracks would follow him into adulthood. Jason grew up in a world that was often defined by appearances. He was a boy who cared about how others saw him, and as he matured into a young man, that habit hardened into a central part of his personality. He liked the spotlight. He liked to be admired. And he learned early that a confident smile, good clothes, and the right words could sometimes open doors that would otherwise remain shut. These traits were not unusual for a teenager in Los Angeles, a city where image can be everything. But for Jason, they were not just teenage habits. They became part of his identity. As he grew older, he developed a taste for expensive things. He wanted luxury cars. He wanted vacations to beautiful places. He wanted to live the kind of life that most people see only on magazine covers or television shows. But what he lacked was the money to pay for it. Jason's finances never matched his dreams. And instead of lowering his ambitions, he found ways to cover the gaps. Little scams here, financial tricks there. Borrowing from one source to pay another. Always moving money around. Always running just one step ahead of his debts. Despite this chaos, to many people who met him, Jason didn't seem like a man in trouble. He was charismatic. He could talk his way into almost anything. Friends described him as fun, adventurous, even charming. Women often noticed him. Men sometimes admired his confidence. He could make people laugh. He could make people feel comfortable. And if you only spent a little time with him, you might walk away thinking he was the kind of person who had life figured out. What most didn't see was the anxiety underneath, the stress of constant financial collapse, and the dishonesty that grew like a shadow behind his smile. Jason Derek Brown's early life was full of contradictions, almost as if he were trying on different identities, testing which version of himself the world might accept. Born in Los Angeles in 1969, he grew up in a fractured household. His parents eventually divorced, and Jason, along with his siblings, spent much of their upbringing with their mother. Even as a boy, Jason had a charisma that made him stand out. Teachers remembered him as charming, sometimes even disarmingly so, though not always the most dedicated student. Raised in a Mormon faith, Jason was part of a culture that strongly encouraged young men to serve 2-year missions abroad. For many in that community, it wasn't optional. It was a rite of passage. After finishing high school, Jason embarked on such a mission in France. There, he immersed himself in a new culture, learned fluent French, and outwardly lived the life of a devoted missionary. But even then, his restless energy and love of attention peeked through. Jason thrived on social interaction. He liked being noticed. While he carried out his duties, those who knew him later said that he seemed less focused on the spiritual calling and more drawn to the adventure of being in Europe, of standing out in a foreign world. When he returned to the United States, Jason did not deepen his ties to the church. Instead, he gravitated toward pleasures and appearances. He wanted people to look at him and think he had made it. By his mid-20s, he was cultivating an image of wealth and sophistication, even if the foundations were shaky. He bought toys that signaled success, luxury items, expensive vacations, and eventually a flashy car that seemed to symbolize the person he wanted others to believe he was. Jason drove a BMW, sleek and stylish, a vehicle that drew attention and fit the image he was trying to sell. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Jason had developed a habit of spending far more than he earned. He financed his lifestyle with a mix of legitimate small business ventures and outright fraud. He dabbled in selling golf equipment, claimed to be an entrepreneur, and was known to brag about deals or investments that often had no real substance behind them. Friends noticed how he could talk his way into or out of almost anything, leaning on that same charm that had carried him through his school years and his mission abroad. Jason's life was built on appearances. He wasn't a man with steady wealth and deep security. He was the man who wanted you to believe that he was. And for a long time, that illusion worked. He threw parties, dressed well, and impressed strangers with his stories. But illusions can only last so long, and Jason Derek Brown was edging closer to a moment when the curtain would be pulled back. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Jason Derek Brown's carefully crafted facade began to strain under the weight of reality. He was, by many accounts, the life of the party. A man who could flash a grin, buy a round of drinks, and captivate people with stories that made his life sound glamorous. He spoke of businesses he was running, opportunities he was pursuing, and investments that promised returns. But those stories often had little substance. The truth was simpler and darker. Jason was living on borrowed time, borrowed money, and borrowed credibility. Debt followed him wherever he went. Credit cards piled up. Small loans from friends were rarely paid back. His mother and siblings sometimes helped him financially, but even they couldn't cover the hole he was digging. Yet Jason never seemed panicked, at least not outwardly. He projected confidence. He had that uncanny ability to make others believe that somehow he would figure it out. He often told people he was just one deal away from everything turning around. What Jason really excelled at was appearances. He lived in nice apartments, always furnished with care, often in communities where the rent was higher than someone with his true financial means could justify. He loved to show up in places where he could be noticed: nightclubs, trendy restaurants, golf courses, and gyms. He exercised, kept himself in good shape, and dressed the part of a man in control. But underneath it all, his bank accounts were nearly empty. He tried to sustain himself through smaller schemes. One of Jason's ventures was a golf equipment business, which he described as if it were a booming operation. In reality, it was modest at best, and at worst, just another story to spin. He bought items on credit, resold them, and used the appearance of a business to project legitimacy. He was good at talking. He was good at persuasion. And for a while, those skills kept him afloat. But by 2004, the house of cards was trembling. Jason was facing serious debt, reportedly over $100,000. His creditors were pressing. His luxurious lifestyle was clashing more and more with his dwindling resources. The BMW he drove was an anchor to his image, the kind of car that turned heads and made strangers assume he was successful. But it was also a constant reminder of how far he was overextending. And there was another darker element creeping into Jason's life. He had a fascination with weapons. Friends said he owned multiple firearms, often boasting about them. Some believed he was preparing for something bigger. Others thought it was part of his self-image. Jason as the rugged, capable man who could protect himself, who had power at his fingertips. Guns gave him a sense of control he was otherwise lacking. The lines between his persona and his reality were blurring. In public, Jason Derek Brown was a slick, charismatic young man with a BMW, stories of success, and an easy smile. In private, he was a man drowning in debt, clinging to illusions, and contemplating desperate solutions. It was in this crucible of pressure and ego that the next chapter of his life would be written. The one that would take him from being a troubled but charming figure to one of America's most wanted fugitives. Jason's debts and image issues have left him cornered, but instead of pulling back, he seemed to lean even further into behaviors that worried those around him. Friends noticed he became quieter in conversation, his usual charisma replaced by a kind of distant preoccupation. He was often seen alone, nursing a drink, or talking about money in vague, half-hearted ways that didn't quite mask the pressure he was under. Beneath the surface, Jason was sliding into something darker. It was around this time that he began frequenting shooting ranges. At first it seemed harmless enough, another expensive hobby that matched his thrill-seeking personality. But regulars at the ranges recalled the intensity with which he practiced. Jason wasn't just casually firing. He studied the mechanics, drilled with his weapons, and asked questions that felt unusually pointed. He bought firearms with money he didn't have, including one particular handgun that would later prove significant. At the time, though, it was just another purchase, one more accessory in his attempt to feel in control. He talked occasionally about self-defense, framing his interest in guns as something practical, even necessary. But the way he carried himself with a weapon, the almost ceremonial way he handled and cared for it, suggested something beyond practicality. It became part of his identity, a secret, private extension of his persona that few people ever saw. Alongside his obsession with firearms came a growing curiosity about cash-heavy businesses. He would linger near armored cars and parking lots, watching the guards as they moved bags of money. Sometimes he'd sit in his car and observe, taking mental notes about how the guards carried themselves, what kind of weapons they had, and how they loaded the trucks. To an outside observer, this might have looked like casual people watching. But Jason wasn't just watching, he was studying. And all of this contrasted sharply with the image he still tried to project. He was still seen out in stylish clothes, still flashed his BMW to impress people, still charmed acquaintances with stories of his so-called business ventures. But the balance was shifting. His double life was becoming harder to maintain. On one side was the man desperate to hold onto the illusion of wealth and confidence. On the other was the man who spent hours in shooting ranges and empty parking lots, quietly preparing for something bigger. While Jason Derek Brown was spiraling deeper into a fantasy of wealth and violence, across town another man was simply doing his job. His name was Robert Keith Palomares. At the time of the crime, Robert was a 24-year-old armored car guard employed by an armored transport company. He was young, diligent, and known among colleagues as reliable. He didn't stand out for flamboyance or arrogance. He was just the kind of worker who showed up on time, did what was asked of him, and carried himself with quiet professionalism. Robert's life was simple compared to Jason's manufactured glamour. He wasn't chasing status or debt-driven appearances. He lived modestly, had friends and family who cared about him, and was respected in his line of work for being steady under pressure. There's a certain understated heroism in people like Robert. Those who go about their days with no pretension, contributing quietly to the machinery of society. His role, carrying bags of money to and from armored cars, might have looked routine to outsiders, but it required courage. Guards like Robert put themselves in the way of potential danger every time they stepped out of a vehicle with cash in hand. The job was high risk by nature. Armored car guards knew it. They trained for the possibility of ambushes, studied how to scan their surroundings, and moved with both caution and confidence. They wore uniforms that marked them as protectors of money, but also as targets. Robert accepted this reality like thousands of others in his field. That day in Phoenix, Arizona, he wore his standard uniform, a dark shirt, the company insignia, a bulletproof vest underneath, utility belt around his waist, and the calm posture of someone focused on finishing another shift. The setting was suburban, almost deceptively ordinary. November of 2004 had cooled the desert air into something crisp, the kind of mild weather that made outdoor errands almost pleasant. Shopping centers hummed with life as people moved in and out of stores, bags in hand, thinking of little more than their daily routines. Among them, armored cars seemed like background noise, big, lumbering vehicles stationed outside, their guards shuffling heavy bags as if part of a daily ballet. Few gave them a second thought, but Jason had been watching. He wasn't part of the humdrum. He was circling, planning, and waiting. On the morning of November 29th, Robert's assignment was straightforward: make a cash pickup from a movie theater. The theater sat in a strip mall in Phoenix, its marquee lit up with posters for films that were pulling in holiday audiences. For customers, the theater meant popcorn, big screens, and a bit of escape. For Robert, it meant walking out with a bag heavy with cash, visible, obvious, and vulnerable. He had likely done similar pickups countless times, a rhythm that felt routine, though the threat of danger always lingered in the background. As Robert carried out his task, he could not have known that Jason Derek Brown was nearby. Jason had already settled on his plan. He was on a bicycle that morning, a simple mountain bike that let him move quietly, inconspicuously. Unlike his flashy BMW, the bike blended into the scenery. Jason wore a dark hooded sweatshirt, gloves, and carried the weapon he had recently acquired, a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Witnesses would later recall seeing a figure, lean, unremarkable, lurking with strange intensity. To them, it might have looked like just another man on a bike. But to Robert, it was the last thing he ever saw. The ambience of that strip mall shifted in an instant. One moment, it was just another cool Arizona morning, the sun rising with desert brightness, people coming and going, children tugging at parent hands. The next moment, the sound of tires crunching, footsteps echoing, and then the sudden, violent crack of gunfire shattered the calm. Jason approached Robert as he exited the theater, cash bag in hand, and opened fire. Robert never had a chance. He was shot multiple times, collapsing instantly, his body falling hard onto the concrete. Witnesses screamed. Some ducked for cover, others froze, paralyzed by the horror of what had just unfolded. Jason snatched the bag, blood splattered across his gloves and sweatshirt, and pedaled away furiously on the bike, weaving through the shocked crowd, disappearing before anyone could stop him. It all happened in seconds, but the aftermath stretched into eternity for those who saw it. For Robert's family, it was the moment their world was irreparably shattered. For Jason, it was the climax of his descent, the point at which illusion gave way to reality. And for Phoenix, it was a crime that left scars on everyone touched by its senselessness. The gunshots echoed like thunder in the confined space of the shopping center. First a single shot, then a rapid burst, each one louder and sharper than the last, ricocheting between storefronts, rattling glass panes, and turning an ordinary Monday morning into chaos. For a brief second after the final shot, there was silence, that stunned silence that follows catastrophe, when people's minds refuse to catch up to what their ears have just heard. Then came the screams. Shoppers dropped their bags and sprinted for cover. Mothers clutched their children. Some people froze in place, paralyzed by fear, staring at the guard's crumpled body on the ground. Robert lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him, the armored cash bag still clenched in one hand, as though his final instinct had been to hold on, to protect. The sun, bright and indifferent, caught the gleam of his badge and the spilled coins that had burst from the torn fabric of the bag. It was a heartbreaking juxtaposition. The symbols of responsibility and livelihood stained red in an instant. Jason, meanwhile, did not linger. He moved with calculated urgency. Witnesses saw a man in dark clothing, his hood pulled tight, his face obscured, vault onto a bicycle with the stolen cash. The small details stand out even now. The screech of the bike tires as he pushed off, the squeak of the chain under sudden force, the blur of his figure weaving through stunned bystanders. He vanished with shocking speed, as if swallowed by the ordinary cityscape. For those left behind, time warped. Some people rushed to Robert's side, though deep down they must have known it was futile. He had been shot multiple times in the head. Others pulled out their cell phones, their hands trembling as they dialed 911, their voices shaky as they tried to describe the scene. A man was shot. The guard, he's down. The guy took the money and left on a bike, one caller said, their voice breaking between sobs. Within minutes, the faint wail of sirens began to swell in the distance. Police cruisers raced toward the scene, tires screaming as they cut through traffic, officers already bracing themselves for what they were about to confront. By the time they arrived, the crowd had grown larger, the scene cordoned off by invisible circles of fear and disbelief. Officers rushed forward, weapons drawn, scanning for threats, but Jason was already gone. What they found was Robert, lifeless on the pavement, his uniform torn, his blood marking the ground like an indelible scar. His fellow guards, who had been nearby, stood in shock, some in tears, others staring blankly, unable to reconcile the violence they had just witnessed with a man they had worked beside only minutes earlier. Detectives moved in quickly, taping off the area, taking statements from witnesses, and trying to preserve what little evidence there was. Shell casings glinted in the sunlight, scattered like grim breadcrumbs. A few had rolled under parked cars, others rested near the theater's entrance. Someone pointed to a faint trail where bike tire tracks cut through dust and debris before disappearing into the street. But as fast as law enforcement moved, Jason had been faster. Within moments of the shooting, he had blended into the sprawl of Phoenix, riding off with over $56,000 in cash. A young man was dead, a community was traumatized, and a murderer was loose. The contrast between the two men could not have been sharper. Jason, privileged, reckless, self-indulgent, pedaled away with stolen money and blood on his hands. Robert, dutiful, humble, devoted, lay in the parking lot, the price of someone else's desperation. The strip mall never looked the same again. For weeks after the crime, people who had been there described being haunted by the sounds, the gunshots, the bicycle tires skidding, the screams. Even years later, some avoided the theater altogether, unable to separate it from the tragedy that had unfolded there. And in that single act of violence, Jason Derek Brown crossed an irreversible line. He was no longer a man juggling lies and debts. He was now a murderer, one of the FBI's most wanted, a fugitive whose face would be plastered across America for years to come. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Phoenix sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the AMC movie theater at 51st Avenue and Thunderbird Road. It was November 29th, 2004, the Monday after Thanksgiving, a day that felt ordinary to everyone who wandered into the plaza for a coffee, a film, or some quick shopping. But ordinary was about to shatter. Jason Derek Brown, dressed inconspicuously, rolled into the lot on a bicycle. It was a mountain bike, small enough to be easily maneuvered, yet quiet enough to blend into the ambient noise of traffic and chatter. His appearance was calculated. He wore a dark hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low, and gloves. To most passers-by, he was just another guy biking through the plaza. No one would guess what was about to unfold. At that very moment, Robert Keith Palomares, a 24-year-old armored car guard for Loomis, had just stepped out of the AMC theater carrying a large canvas money bag. The bag held $56,000 in cash, collections from the weekend box office receipts. Robert had done this countless times before. He was young, hardworking, and meticulous, the kind of man who took his job seriously but never let the danger of it shake his calm demeanor. Dressed in his Loomis uniform, a crisp white shirt beneath his protective vest, black pants, and his duty belt, he looked professional, almost imposing, but also familiar to the locals who often saw him on these runs. As Robert exited the theater, he moved with steady purpose toward the armored car. He had no reason to suspect anything unusual. It was broad daylight, the plaza was full of people, and his routine was one he knew by heart. Jason, watching from his bicycle, tightened his grip on the pistol tucked discreetly under his clothing. The weapon was a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun, powerful and devastating at close range. It wasn't his first time handling it. Then, in one swift motion, Jason rode up behind Robert and drew the gun. Witnesses later said they heard a sharp burst of sound. Not one shot, but several in rapid succession. Jason fired 5 times, the reports exploding like thunderclaps across the open-air lot. The shots echoed violently against the theater walls, startling moviegoers and shoppers. Some froze, others screamed. A few instinctively ducked for cover behind parked cars. The chaos was immediate. Robert staggered, struck multiple times at close range. One of the bullets hit him in the head, and the young guard collapsed almost instantly to the pavement. The money bag tumbled from his grasp, spilling slightly open as it hit the ground, a blur of green bank straps and bills visible for a fleeting second. Jason didn't hesitate. He leaned off his bike, grabbed the bag, and swung it up in one practice motion. For a moment, the scene froze in disbelief. A uniformed guard lying motionless, money half spilled on the asphalt, bystanders stunned at what they had just witnessed. Then Jason pedaled hard. The tires of the mountain bike screeched against the pavement as he sped away, the bag clutched tightly in his grip. People shouted, some pointed, and a handful of witnesses tried to give chase on foot, but the bicycle was too quick, too nimble in weaving through parked cars. Behind him, the echo of gunfire still hung in the air, mingling with the wails of sirens already beginning to rise in the distance. Within seconds, Jason was gone, swallowed by the suburban streets. Robert lay on the ground as emergency calls poured in. Strangers rushed to him, horrified by the blood pooling beneath his head, their hands trembling as they try to check for a pulse, try to do something, anything, to stop the inevitable. But the injuries were catastrophic. The parking lot of a movie theater, a place meant for entertainment and leisure, had become a crime scene. A young man's life had been extinguished in broad daylight, and the killer had escaped with a fortune stuffed in a canvas bag. The sheer brazenness of it was staggering. Jason Dara Brown had not only executed a guard in public, but he had done so with chilling precision, firing multiple shots without hesitation, then disappearing into the everyday flow of city life as if he were just another commuter on 2 wheels. Witnesses later said the entire event lasted no more than a few seconds. But in those seconds, the world of Robert Palomares' family, and indeed of Phoenix itself, changed forever. Sirens wailed almost as soon as the final gunshot echoes faded. Within minutes of the shooting, Phoenix police cruisers and emergency vehicles converged on the AMC Theater Plaza, their flashing lights painting the scene in jolting streaks of red and blue. Shoppers who had crouched behind cars now stood in shock, giving frantic statements to dispatchers over their cell phones, pointing toward the direction where the gunman had fled. The once bustling parking lot was now a tableau of chaos. Bodies rushing, voices raised, the smell of burnt gunpowder still faintly lingering in the air. Paramedics rushed to Robert Palomares. They dropped to their knees beside him, working quickly to assess his wounds. But the injuries were catastrophic, the kind that even the most skilled trauma team couldn't reverse. Multiple gunshot wounds, including a fatal head wound, left little room for hope. Despite their efforts, Robert was pronounced dead at the scene. He was only 24 years old. His armored vest and uniform, meant to symbolize protection and security, were stained with the finality of violence. As word spread across police radios, every available unit in the area was alerted. A Loomis guard had been gunned down, and a shooter was on the run. Last seen escaping on a bicycle with a large sum of cash. Officers scrambled to seal off nearby streets. Patrol cars screeched into surrounding neighborhoods. Officers scanning sidewalks, alleys, and driveways for any sign of a man on a bike, possibly carrying a heavy bag. Helicopters buzzed overhead, spotlights slicing through the early evening gloom. The search was immediate, aggressive, but Jason Derek Brown had chosen his method of escape carefully. On a bike, he could slip into residential areas, weave through traffic, cut across parking lots, and disappear into places patrol cars couldn't reach in time. Back at the crime scene, detectives arrived to take charge. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the lot, cordoning off the area as uniformed officers ushered bystanders away. Witnesses were pulled aside, interviewed one by one. Some were trembling, their voices shaky as they described what they had seen. A man in dark clothing, wearing a cap, gloves, and possibly sunglasses. One woman insisted he had a calm, almost calculated demeanor. Another swore she saw him fire more than once. Their accounts, though fragmented by fear, all painted the same chilling picture: a sudden, brutal ambush in broad daylight. The money bag was gone. $56,000 in cash, gone in seconds. What remained was the body of a young guard who had been doing his job, and a community shaken by the sheer brazenness of the attack. The location made it even more shocking. Not some isolated street corner or hidden alleyway, but a crowded shopping plaza on a Monday afternoon. Parents who had brought their children to the theater now huddled them close, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow in the wake of the violence they had just witnessed. News crews descended almost as quickly as the police. Cameras zoomed in on the cordoned-off parking lot, capturing the frantic activity, the flashing lights, and the stark sight of a Loomis armored truck idling near the theater entrance, its doors still open, its purpose suddenly hollow. Anchors cut into local broadcasts with breaking news alerts. An armored car guard has been shot and killed outside an AMC theater in Phoenix. The suspect is armed, dangerous, and on the loose. The FBI was contacted that very evening. The brutality of the crime, the theft of such a large sum, and the possibility of the suspect fleeing across state lines elevated the urgency. By nightfall, Jason Derek Brown's name had not yet surfaced, but the wheels of a massive manhunt had begun turning. For Robert's fellow Loomis employees, the scene was unbearable. Guards who had worked alongside him stood silently as investigators documented the sight, their faces grim, their hands clenched. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered under their breath about how quickly it had all happened. One of them later recalled that Robert was a good kid, quiet, dependable, and that seeing him lying on the asphalt, his duty ended so violently, felt like losing family. By the end of the night, Phoenix police released a stark message to the public. The killer was still out there, considered armed and extremely dangerous. They urged anyone with information to come forward, promising swift justice for the slain guard. But for those on the scene that day, the chilling reality set in. A young man had been murdered in broad daylight for money, and his killer had vanished into the night. The hours after the shooting gave way to days, and investigators worked relentlessly to untangle the threads of what had happened outside the AMC theater. Phoenix homicide detectives coordinated with the FBI, setting up a task force that would combine resources, intelligence, and manpower. The crime scene itself yielded important clues. Shell casings from a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun were carefully collected from the asphalt. Ballistics experts quickly matched the weapon type to a rare and distinctive purchase, one that wasn't made by just anyone in Arizona at the time. When investigators ran the ballistics data, the pieces started to click. They discovered that a similar handgun had recently been purchased by none other than Jason Derek Brown, a 33-year-old man living in the Phoenix area. That purchase was made just weeks before the murder. At first, Jason's name didn't carry the weight of a hardened criminal. On paper, he seemed like a man who led a flashy, carefree lifestyle. Investigators learned he lived in an upscale townhouse in a Watuki foothills, surrounded himself with expensive toys, and was known to frequent nightclubs, projecting the image of someone with endless money. But those who dug deeper realized it was all a facade. He was drowning in debt, financing his image with credit cards, fake business ventures, and loans he never paid back. As agents canvassed Jason's background, they began to see a troubling picture. His reputation with neighbors and acquaintances varied. Some remembered him as charming, always smiling, always throwing parties that made him appear popular. Others whispered that he was reckless, manipulative, and dishonest. A man who was always looking for shortcuts, never truly working hard, but determined to look the part of someone important. Witnesses at the crime scene described the suspect. Short light brown hair, possibly a beard or stubble, a baseball cap pulled low. Jason's driver's license photo bore a striking resemblance to those accounts. Still, investigators needed more. And that more came from the gun itself. A man who had gone target shooting with Jason in the weeks before the crime came forward. He recalled Jason showing off his new handgun, practicing with it in a remote desert area. The description of the weapon matched perfectly with the casings found at the scene. When police followed up, they discovered Jason had abruptly disappeared after the murder. His townhouse was empty, his belongings hastily abandoned. A neighbor said Jason had borrowed their car shortly before the shooting and never returned it. Another person recalled seeing him loading belongings into a vehicle, appearing nervous, as though he was preparing to leave for good. Detectives secured a warrant and entered his home. What they found confirmed their suspicions. Ammunition, receipts for firearm purchases, and evidence of his mounting financial troubles. Jason, once just a name on a receipt, was now the prime suspect in the murder of Robert Palomares. By mid-December 2004, an arrest warrant was officially issued for Jason Derek Brown on charges of first-degree murder and armed robbery. The FBI added his name to their files, noting his strong ties to multiple states, including California, Utah, and even possible connections to overseas locations due to his past missionary work. Brown wasn't just a criminal. He was a man with resources, charm, and a knack for slipping away unnoticed. But what shocked investigators most was how cleanly he seemed to have vanished. His home sat dark and empty, like he had simply walked out of his life without looking back. Robert's family, meanwhile, was living a nightmare. His mother and siblings spoke to reporters, pleading for justice. They described Robert as a hard-working, humble young man who had taken pride in his role at Loomis. They remembered his easy smile, his dedication to helping others, and the simple joy he found in life outside of work. The fact that his life had been cut short in such a violent, calculated way left them reeling. Their grief became a quiet backdrop to the manhunt, a reminder of what had been lost in the chaos of Jason's greed. For investigators, the case was no longer just about a robbery. It was about hunting a man who had killed in cold blood and then disappeared into the fabric of everyday life. Jason Derek Brown wasn't just a suspect. He was a fugitive, and he was just getting started. On December 6, 2004, only a week after Robert Keith Palomares was gunned down, Jason was officially charged with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. The U.S. Marshal Service and the FBI's Fugitive Task Force began working together, piecing through every shred of Jason's past to predict where he might run. At first, their hunt focused on the Phoenix and Salt Lake City areas, hoping he hadn't gone far. But almost immediately, Jason proved he was more elusive than they imagined. His credit cards went cold. His known addresses turned up empty. Even his friends and relatives, those who might normally serve as anchors for a man on the run, had little to offer, either because they knew nothing or because Jason was deliberately keeping them in the dark. In those initial days, agents studied his profile closely. Jason was a man who thrived on reinvention. He could step into a room and make himself seem like he belonged, even if he was wildly out of place. He was comfortable around strangers, quick with a smile, and gifted at bending truth into whatever shape it needed to take. This wasn't a criminal hardened by years in prison or someone who stood out for a long record of violence. Instead, Jason had the advantage of seeming ordinary, even harmless. That made him dangerous in a very different way. Investigators also considered his unusual skill set. Jason had once been a Mormon missionary in France, where he spent time knocking on doors and learning how to talk to anyone in any situation. He left that mission fluent in French and with a comfort for blending into foreign environments. To FBI analysts, that raised the alarming possibility that Jason might not just be hiding in the United States. He could very well have slipped across a border, vanishing into a country where he could move with ease, pass as a tourist, and never raise suspicion. At the same time, agents noticed how carefully he had prepared. They believed Jason had been saving money in the weeks before the crime, squirreling away cash for the life of a fugitive. He had ditched certain patterns, like the regular gym visits that once defined him. Even his style of dressing, once flashy, often showing off expensive bikes, watches, and clothing, was something he could shed quickly if he needed to disappear. He was adaptable, and that made him slippery. The early stages of the manhunt were marked by hope and frustration in equal measure. Hope that a man like Jason, vain and social, wouldn't be able to resist contact with someone who might betray him. Frustration when leads fizzled out, when every tip ended at a dead end, when sightings turned out to be cases of mistaken identity. Each week that passed without an arrest only deepened the mystery. Where had Jason gone? How could a man so well photographed, so distinctive, simply vanish? By the spring of 2005, investigators had come to a sobering realization. Jason Derek Brown was not going to surface easily. He wasn't leaning on credit cards, he wasn't calling old friends, and he wasn't making mistakes that left a digital trail. Jason Derek Brown had slipped into a shadowy version of his life, one in which his name and face were liabilities. The FBI understood the stakes. This wasn't simply about solving a crime. A father and husband had been executed in cold blood, and the killer was still free. It was also about sending a message. Someone could not commit such a brutal, calculated act and then just disappear without consequence. So, after months of frustration, the Bureau made a decision that elevated the case onto the national stage. In December 2007, Jason Derek Brown was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. The placement was more than symbolic. That list wasn't reserved for just anyone. It was meant for individuals whose capture was considered a matter of urgent public interest, people who posed a continued danger, or whose escape was a direct challenge to law enforcement itself. Jason's case checked every box. He had murdered an innocent man for money, and he had proven himself adept at vanishing into thin air. Once his name was added, Jason's face appeared on wanted posters, television reports, and newspapers across the United States. Tips began to pour in from nearly every corner of the country. Some claimed to have spotted him in Utah. Others swore they had seen him in California. The FBI chased leads as far away as Canada, France, and even Thailand. Jason's fluency in French only deepened the concern that he could slip into parts of Europe without raising suspicion. For the agents tracking him, the challenge was maddening. Unlike many fugitives who relied on criminal networks or repeat patterns, Jason was unpredictable. He could surf couches, live quietly in motels, or reinvent himself as a handyman, a teacher, even a tourist. His education and easy charm were tools he knew how to weaponize. And because his crime had been meticulously planned, investigators couldn't help but wonder, had Jason been preparing his escape long before the murder itself? What made the manhunt especially haunting was how often Jason seemed just out of reach. There were times when witnesses described men who looked exactly like him. Same sandy hair, same casual athletic build, same quick smile. But when agents closed in, the lead would dissolve into nothing. It was as though Jason had perfected the art of being almost seen, a ghost flickering at the edge of recognition. With each passing year, the story deepened. This wasn't only about one man's violent crime anymore. It was about the myth of Jason Derek Brown, how a suburban kid had become one of the most enigmatic fugitives in modern America. Once Jason Derek Brown's name landed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, the case transformed overnight. What had been the work of detectives and field agents suddenly became a nationwide obsession. His face, clean-cut and unassuming, was splashed across newspapers, aired on evening news programs, and printed on posters tacked to post office bulletin boards. He didn't look like the stereotypical fugitive. No hardened features, no battle scars from a life of crime. Instead, he resembled the kind of man you might pass in a grocery store or see chatting at a coffee shop. Ordinary, approachable, even likable. That was precisely what made him so dangerous and what made the hunt so frustrating. The attention brought with it a torrent of tips. Calls flooded into FBI offices from Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California. Some swore they had spotted him walking out of a convenience store. Others claimed to have seen him working construction jobs under an alias. A few even reported seeing him inside gyms, lifting weights as if nothing had ever happened. In each instance, agents scrambled, chasing down the leads, only to discover that the man in question was just a look-alike. These false alarms carried a psychological weight. For investigators, every call demanded time, manpower, and resources. For Jason, the flood of attention may have worked in his favor. By looking so ordinary, so forgettable, he blended in with the millions of men who shared his features. In a way, his very normalcy was his disguise. But among the sea of mistaken identities, one sighting stood out. In 2008, years after the murder of Robert Palomares, Jason was reportedly seen at a zoo in Salt Lake City. This wasn't one of the vague, uncertain reports that could be dismissed as rumor. A credible witness, someone who knew him well, was certain it was Jason. He was described as calm, almost casual, walking through the zoo grounds as if he were just another tourist enjoying a quiet day. By the time authorities followed up, he had vanished again, leaving behind nothing more than the eerie knowledge that he had, at least once, brushed shoulders with everyday families in a public place. That single verified sighting underscored the unsettling reality. Jason wasn't hiding deep underground or in some faraway wilderness. He was moving through public spaces, invisible in plain sight. Perhaps that was his greatest trick, not running to the far ends of the earth, but fading into the ordinary lives of others. The media amplified the tension. Documentaries, true crime shows, and articles dissected every known detail of his life. Was he still in the United States? Had he crossed into Mexico? Was he quietly living in Europe, relying on his French skills to reinvent himself? The questions only added to the myth. For the public, Jason became a figure both feared and strangely fascinating. The handsome con man who killed for money and then disappeared into the world as if swallowed by it. And so, year after year, the sightings continued. In diners, in churches, in small towns, and big cities. A face glimpsed on a sidewalk. A man at a bus stop. Always close, always possible, yet never quite certain. Each report forced the same cycle. Hope, investigation, disappointment. Meanwhile, Jason remained just beyond reach, like a shadow on the move. The family of Robert Keith Palomares, the armored truck guard murdered that November night, was left with a wound that would never fully heal. Robert wasn't just a name and a headline. He was a son, a brother, an uncle, and a friend. Those who knew him remembered a man who was steady, dependable, and deeply loyal to his loved ones. At 39 years old, he had built a life rooted in responsibility and quiet strength. He took pride in his work, and while dangerous, it was a job that helped support the people he cared about most. When news of his death spread, the devastation was immediate and profound. For his family, the idea that Robert's life could be stolen in an instant, snuffed out not by an accident of fate, but by a deliberate, calculated act of violence, was unbearable. Thanksgiving had passed only days earlier, and the holiday season, which should have been filled with warmth and togetherness, now carried only silence and sorrow. His loved one spoke of how Robert had always been careful. He understood the risks of armored transport. He had routines. He stayed alert. But even the most vigilant man could not have predicted a lone gunman lying in wait with a bicycle as his getaway vehicle. The sheer senselessness of it. Murder committed not out of personal vendetta, but for a satchel of cash, was a weight that bore down on everyone who knew him. The trial that never came only deepened that pain. Families of murder victims often cling to the hope of justice, the idea that a courtroom can provide closure or at least accountability. But Robert's family never got that chance. Jason's flight meant that the story stalled, suspended in limbo. Instead of conviction, there was a face on a poster. Instead of sentencing, there were endless what-ifs. In interviews given over the years, Robert's relatives spoke quietly of their frustration, but also their resilience. They wanted people to know the man behind the badge and the uniform. He wasn't just an armored car guard. He was a person whose laughter filled family gatherings, whose presence made others feel safe. His absence wasn't measured in headlines, but in birthdays missed, in holidays darkened, in the daily ache of a chair left empty at the table. For them, every new sighting of Jason Derek Brown was a reopening of the wound. Each possible lead stirred the hope that maybe this time he would finally be caught. And each disappointment meant another cycle of grief, another reminder that Robert's killer was still free. The Palomares family's pain serves as the heart of this tragedy. Beyond the headlines and FBI wanted posters, it was their lives that were permanently altered. Justice delayed, perhaps denied, meant their mourning never fully ended. And while the world speculated about Jason's whereabouts, they carried the quiet burden of loss day after day, year after year. What makes Jason Derek Brown's story so chilling is not only the crime itself, but the way it has refused to find closure. as time stretched on, the case grew colder, and Jason became less of a fixture in the headlines. In 2022, after nearly 2 decades of searching, the FBI quietly removed him from their 10 most wanted fugitives list. It was a rare decision, but it reflected a sobering reality. That despite the resources poured into his pursuit, he remained at large, and the trail had gone quiet. The reward of up to $200,000 for information leading to his capture still sits unclaimed, a reminder of how close yet impossibly far justice has remained. And so, the story lingers in an uneasy balance. On one side, a grieving family that never truly found closure after the loss of Robert Palomares, a man who had shown up to work that night, simply doing his job. On the other, a fugitive who vanished into the folds of ordinary life, a man who may walk among crowds unseen, or who may already have faded into obscurity. Thank you for listening to the story of Jason Derek Brown. If you found this journey into one of America's most elusive fugitives captivating, feel free to find more haunting stories from the True Crime series here on this channel. For now, may the night be calm, and may your rest be undisturbed. Good night.